Hello there, friends. Welcome to Coding and Testing and Authentication API with Node.js and Cypress. In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to create an authentication API using Node.js. We're going to be able to register brand new users using a RESTful API, and we're going to be able to log in with those users using that same RESTful API. And along the way, we're actually even going to learn how to test the code that we write using Cypress, REST API testing, so that we know that as we make changes to our code, it continues to work. So what are you waiting for? Let's dive right in. All right, friends, so let's go ahead and get started in this tutorial. As you can see, I'm in this folder, Auth API tutorial. There's nothing in there yet if we check. So let's go ahead and initialize it doing npm init y. So this will create our package.json. So now you can see that something appeared in here. If we open up this package.json, it just has some information and it's going to store our packages and any other information that we want to throw in there. All right, next we're going to install Express, which is going to be our server, and then we're going to install Nodemon, which will restart our server, but we're going to do save dev here to add it to our dev dependencies. So you'll notice that our package.json is getting populated. So we got Express and Nodemon. All right, next, let's go ahead and add an index.json. Sorry, not index.json, index.js. And in here, we're gonna grab a couple of dependencies. We're gonna need Express. Express, and we're also going to need an app, which is going to use Express, just like that. And then we are going to have our app listening on a port, and here we can put in, let's say, port 3000, and then we'll do an arrow function. And then we can just do a console message that will tell us something like server is running. And now we can test it out to see if we can actually start our server. And to do that, all you have to do is nodemon index.js. There you go, server is running. See that? So now we do have a server running. We can kill it for now because we don't need it. But to make it easier, we can actually grab this entire thing and put it in our package.json. We can add a start script and we can put all of that in here. Just like that. And so now we can do, and that also starts it, but with less words. And we always like less words. So let's go ahead and stop that. If you're enjoying this tutorial and want to support this channel, be sure to hit the thumbs up button for the video. And if you want to be notified of every time a new tutorial is released, hit the subscribe button. All right, cool. So how about we actually add our first endpoint? So let's come here, add a new folder, and we'll call this routes. And inside of this new folder, we'll add a new file and we'll call this auth.js. And so in here, we will create our very first endpoint. We're going to create a register endpoint so that a user can actually sign up for our service. So for that, we're going to require a few dependencies. We're going to require a route, and that'll be express, and then we're going to need router. And from that, we will do a router post. And this takes a, here we're defining the endpoint. So we're going to say this is going to be our register endpoint. And then we're going to do an arrow function that's going to take in a request and a response. We can just send something back for now and say something like send, and that'll be register. Cool. And so ultimately this will be part of an API where we're going to define something like app.use, and then we're going to set /API/user and or register and so on and so forth. That we're going to define that right now. So let's go back to our index.js, and instead of this we're going to actually do some working code. So let's create an auth route. And that's going to require what we just created. Routes and auth.json, JS. I don't know why I keep saying JSON. And let's put this up there. Instead of app.listen, we're going to do app.use. And here we're starting to define our endpoint, so we can say /API/user and then auth route. And then this will continue to listen, and this is all good. So let's give this a run. Crash. Let's take a look, see what we've got going on. Oh yeah, that's a simple problem. Router is not defined. I put route here, router up there. I was wondering why my IntelliSense wasn't helping me out here, and I had to do it from memory. So now that we got that going, let's give this another shot. Oh, of course, I think I know what happened is I never did a module that exports here. There we go. Problems galore, but that's what happens when you do live coding. There we go. Fantastic. So why don't we actually test out what we've got? So since we're doing a post, can't simply open a browser. So let's open up Postman. Postman is a really great tool for doing API testing. You can just download it. It's absolutely free. You can see I opened it up here, and this is what it looks like. And here I have this request here. I'm just going to copy it, start a new one, put that in. So we're hitting localhost 3000 API, I think user, and register. And then if we do a post, by the way, how did we come up with that? Well, we've got, of course, with the servers running locally, so it's always localhost, right? And then we've got port 3000, which we've got right there. And then we've got API/user, and then we added a register endpoint in the auth.json. So now doing a post, because I'll show you in a moment, that should send requests, and look, we get back register. And how did we choose that it was a post? Well, that was an auth.json. You can see that we're sending a post and we're getting back a register. Fantastic, right? Our very first endpoint up, running, and actually working. So as much fun as it is to actually do all this manually, right, and explore it, wouldn't it be really nice to write some automated tests and make sure that our endpoints are working always and we don't have to manually keep checking them in Postman? Yes, of course it would. That's why we are here. So let's open up a new terminal here, and let's see, let's navigate to Auth API tutorial, and this looks good to me. And let's go ahead and npm install Cypress, and then we're gonna do save dev. So Cypress is an automated testing tool that allows you to do front-end web automation as well as API testing. And so that's why we're doing it. And it allows you to do like mocking and spying and all of that as well. So it's a very powerful tool that we enjoy, that we're going to use to do our API testing because it has really good capabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and let it finish installing. Alrighty, cool. There it is. Cypress installed successfully. We can go to our package.json and we can see that we have Cypress here now. And if we come to our Auth API tutorial, we can do Cypress open. It's going to open up a Cypress UI. Give it a moment to open up. Cool, check it out. And we get this little window here that comes up and says, hey, we've added a bunch of examples for you in the Cypress integration folder. So you can come here and say, okay, cool, look, and then you can actually run these tests. For example, you can come here, click this action.spec.js, and it will execute. Look, it's actually opening up a Chrome browser and it's going to run it. Give it a moment. It's opening up on my other window. Here it is, and we'll actually get to see all of these tests execute in a real browser. Of course, we're not doing browser testing. We're doing API testing, so we're not going to have this pretty UI here that shows up with all of these different actions, but it will still be a very nice user experience. So we can go ahead and close this. We don't need that. And actually what we're going to do is clean up our tests a bit. So let's come back up here. You can see now we have a Cypress folder. Let's go ahead and come to the integration folder, and we're basically just going to delete all the examples, which we're not going to need. So instead, we can come here, create a new directory, and call it specs. And now let's go ahead and add a new test. We're going to call this auth.spec.js. So this is going to contain our tests for the auth file. So to get started with Cypress, we can just start typing a command. You can see it comes from Cypress, so we can use that and define a title of our test. So the very first test that we want to do is maybe that it returns the register when we hit the register API, right? So maybe we can say something like returns register when we hit slash register, right? Excellent. So with that, let's actually write our test. And so for that, we use the Cypress command that will allow us to perform a bunch of different operations. And we can do cypress.request. And then we can do post. And then we'll put the endpoint that we want to hit, which I'm quickly gonna get from Postman over here on my other screen of Postman. The site's, there it is. So we're gonna put that in here. And then once we do that request, we are going to get back a response. And so then we can say, then, and we can actually move this down. Oh. So then what we're expecting back is a response object. And so with this response object, we can expect that the response body to, this is all coming from Cypress now, contain, and we can pass in a string and say register. And so this is the exact same test that we just did manually, but through an automated manner. And so now, actually, if we bring Cypress back, the Cypress UI, we can run through command line, or we can run through this Cypress UI. What you see here is it actually updated. Remember, it had a bunch of different specs here now. Now we only have the one, and we have the one that I defined, and it's called auth.spec.js. And then we can actually run it and see what happens. Cool, fantastic. And look, you can see that the test actually returned successfully. So you can see that a post returned the 200, and hitting this API returned the string register, right? Just so you see that I'm not making this up, why don't we do multiple R's? And then we'll pull Cypress back. We can, you see, we run the test and the test actually fails because we expected one thing and then we got back another. And so, of course, you can even kill the server and then try to rerun the test. The test will rerun automatically. And you can see the test is going to time out because our server is not running. So yes, this is a real working automated test that we just got with Cypress. Okay, fantastic. I am back with a brand new shirt, brand new haircut, and a brand new shave. So hopefully this helps me to be a better developer. Anyways, one thing I didn't like about this Cypress test was that us returning a register, that's not really what our API is going to do at the end. So it was a silly test. It was a test to show you how Cypress works and how to test our API, but it wasn't a realistic test. So I wanted to make something that's more robust and that's going to live as our requirements keep changing. So here we're just changing it to returns 200 when we hit register. And all I did here was say expect the response.status, and of course the IDE will guide us here to equal 200. So it doesn't matter whether it returns register or whether it actually has working functionality. Our endpoint is going to return 200. And so now we can rerun this test. And one thing I wanted to show you is how to run these tests in command line, and we can just do npx cypress run, and this will actually execute the tests. You can already see what a report looks like. It's a nice little report, making sure you're in the right folder, of course. Yep, and so you can see it executed single spec, one test, everything is passing, 97 milliseconds. Fantastic. And with all of that said, let's go ahead now and add Mongoose to our packages JSON. Oh, and one other thing before we move on, let's go to our package JSON and make our life easier for testing. All right, so we're just gonna go ahead and add another line here. and this is going to be for testing. And here we're just gonna do Cypress run. And so now we can come to our command line and do npm test, and that will run our Cypress. And so yeah, the UI is very pretty and nice to look at, but command line is really quickly and easy to execute. All right, well, so let's hook up to an actual database and start saving some information, right? So what you're gonna need to go is Google MongoDB and then just log in. You can create an absolutely free account. Once you are in, you're gonna come here and you're gonna say build a cluster. And so then of course you have an option to choose from. We of course like the free option. So we're gonna come here, click create a cluster. Then you get to pick all of your information. Not really too relevant. Everything here looks fantastic. As long as it says free, I am happy. And then I'm gonna click create cluster. Now they want me to choose some motorcycles. Make sure you select the correct motorcycles. And now the clusters are going to be created. While that's being created, we can come over here to database access. You can see we already have a single user here that we can use for accessing our database. If we need others, we can come here and add new database users. So while that server spins up, why don't we actually do some work over here, and we're going to come to our index.json and we're gonna create a connection to that database that we are just working on. So that's why we installed Mongoose, is to be able to create a connection and set up a model. So we can do Mongoose, and then we can require Mongoose. There it is. Fantastic. And now we're gonna actually establish a connection to the database. And so to do that, what we're gonna do is mongoose.connect, and then it's asking for a URI here. So to do that, we're gonna come back to our database, come here to the clusters, connect cluster, we can click that. And then we are going to copy this string, not forgetting to add our password here and the database name, or the name of the database that Connections will use by default. So we're gonna copy this, we're gonna come back here, we're gonna supply this string right in there, right? My password that I did was test 1 2 3 4 5. This cluster looks good, and the database name. Let's go and fetch that. So we don't actually need to fetch this. We can just give this any name that we want. So why don't we say auth db. We'll call it that, and then we're also going to pass in these two parameters here, use new URL parser, and then we're just simply gonna log that we are connected to the database. And so with that, we can come here, you can see it's already automatically restarting, and fantastic. And we are now successfully connected to an actual database. And if you're worried about exposing your username and access key publicly, don't worry, we're gonna handle that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and handle this massive security flaw of exposing your username and access key in your database connection string. So for that, we're gonna need a package called .env. So we're just gonna do npm install .env. Fantastic. Then over down here, we're just gonna call it .env. and then it's going to require .env. Perfect. And then we are going to set up an environment variable. So set up to be from a file, and then we're just going to do .env .config, and then down here, this entire connection string we can actually replace with something else. But first, we are going to need a file here. And so for that, we can come here to our Auth API tutorial. So we're going to come here, add a new file. This one will simply be called .env. All right, so this will store our secret environment variables, right? Username, access key, connection strings, API keys for certain services. This is where we want to place it. So we are going to take this entire string. We're going to get it out of here, and we're going to put that in here. Okay. And then we're going to give this a name. Let's call it db_connect. Fantastic. And now let's go back here and reference this string. So that's simply doing process.env and then db_connect. All right, and so that is how we've hidden it. So now at this point, if we're using a source control system such as GitHub, now we can check this in, and you actually just make sure that you add this to your git ignore. So you come and add to your git ignore so that it's never checked in, lives on your local environment, can live in your CI system, but never in source control. And so now, of course, you can come here. Let's see. You can see our server is restarting, and it's connected to the DB. So everything is all good and dandy. Okay, I'm back. I had to quickly throw on a hoodie and make myself a cup of delicious hibiscus tea because over here it's kind of cold in Florida. It's a freezing 71 degrees, which I know many people are like, oh, Nikolai, you're crazy. But it's funny how your body changes. When we used to live in the northern freezing cold of Virginia, 71 would be like an okay temperature. And now in Florida, my sleeping temperature is 74 degrees. So anything below that, actually at 74, I'm already freezing cold and need a blanket. So at 71, that's like hoodie and sweatpants weather. But anyways, I digress. Let's now actually work on creating a user model so that we can actually start registering some users onto our register API. So for that, why don't we come here to tutorial, and we'll add a new folder and we'll call that model. And then we'll add a new file called users. Cool, so this will represent our users. And so we're gonna need mongoose here, so const mongoose. Require mongoose, excellent. And then for the purposes of saving us time, I will simply just paste a model in here that I've previously created and explain it to you step by step. So here we're creating a user schema object. And we're saying that this object is going to have several properties, right? There's going to have a name property that's going to be of a type string. It's going to be mandatory, have a minimum of 6 characters, a maximum of 255. I guess maybe this one is a silly requirement, right? Because some people have less than 6 character names. But okay, let's just go with that. By the way, these are some really nice things that we can potentially test in the future, making sure that if these are the requirements that these maintain, right? Email field, pretty much same thing. We've got a password field that's also string required, minimum 6 characters, maximum 1024. And then we've got a date field. It's of a type date, and the default value is date.now. And oh yeah, and of course you have to export it. So we're exporting Mongoose model, and then we're calling this a user, and then we're passing in our user schema object that we created above. Okay, so let's use this actual user schema, and we're gonna come here to auth.js, and we're gonna need to import it. So require, and we're gonna require the file that we just created. That was in route. That wasn't in routes. That was in model and users. There you go. Fantastic. And so now this is where we finally get to update this to actually do something valuable instead of sending a register a response. And so we can do create a user. It's going to be a new user. And this user is going to have several properties that are going to be set when we hit the endpoint. So of course we need the name, right? That was a mandatory field, and we can get that from request.body.name. So that's going to be coming from the request body, okay? Then we need an email, right? That was also mandatory, and that's going to come from request body email. And then we need a password, and that's going to come from request body password. All right. Just making sure that everything looks good here. This looks good. And so now what we're going to do is actually try to save this. So we're going to do try. We're going to do a const saved user. Save. Oh, and I'm missing an async here. That's why this was complaining for the wait. Because this is this request can obviously take some time. And then we're going to do response.send. And we're going to send back the saved user information. And if that doesn't work, we can do a catch. And response.send, we're going to send back, response.status. We're going to send back a 400 and send also the error message. All right, fantastic. So this will allow us to create a new user, save the user to the database, and if it doesn't work, it'll throw a 400. By the way, I hope you're noticing all the possible automated tests that we can be writing here to validate different kinds of logic. And the only other thing that I need to tell you is that we actually can't just read directly from the body like this. So what we need to do is come up with a body parser. And so we will do that in index.js. All right, and so here, I'm complaining. That's okay. So here we're gonna need to import our, we're just gonna need to create a middleware. So I'm just thinking here we got Set up to read environment variables. We're connecting to the database. Here we can create a middleware. And here is where we can do app.use express.json. Oh, and I did it totally the wrong way. That should be like that. There you go. Use express.json. And then this is the route middleware. And then everything else is good. Okay, so now it should be able to read our body. So let's actually go ahead and give this a shot and see if everything is working. So let's pull up our little handy little Postman here. We've got our register API, right? Then with this now, for example, if we hit this now, you can see, by the way, that we get validator errors, right? Name validator error, name is required, email is required, and so on, right? So it's telling us what is required, which is really nice. Could be a really good automated test. Furthermore, we then need to supply a body. So we're gonna do raw JSON, and let's supply some JSON in here. So we need a name. So that's gonna be, let's do Nikolai, because that is my name. We need an email, and that will be love my tutorials at email.com. And then let's do a password. How about please love me? That's a good password. So now let's give this a shot. Let's send this, and we get back our object. So check it out. We get back an ID. We get back our name, email, password, and a date. How awesome is that? And just to remind you, where all of that is coming from is here in auth.json. In our users model. You can see that we defined all of this, which we made things required, right? Those are the 3 required fields. The date is not required. And so then when we call /register, a new user is created with this information. And then if everything works, right, if this, we can save the user, we send back a response with that saved user. And that saved user has those fields that we specified in the users.js. And so as a result, it looks like that. Let's go ahead and actually write an automated test for this so we don't have to do this manually. All right, so let's go ahead and actually write some API tests. You might think I'm crazy, but I actually enjoy writing tests. It's such a pleasure writing unit tests, integration tests, acceptance tests, visual tests. All of them are so much fun to write. I think it's partly because it just makes me feel safe when I have tests and I have a working system that if I make any changes and the tests continue to pass, I just feel super comfortable. And it's also fun too. So let's go back here to Cypress, go to our integrations folder, specs, auth spec, right? So, oh, by the way, let's see if this still works, if I design this test well enough. So we just do npm test. It should work because it does return a 200. Oh, it does not. It did not work. So let's see why it broke. Oh yeah, now it's, yeah, it's not gonna work because it's requesting a user. So we can actually just go ahead and fix this test so that it actually does work. So let's see here. We can maintain this test, but all we're gonna do is now add a body, right? So let body equals to a new object, and so it's gonna have a name. It doesn't matter. Test, say Nikolai. Okay, actually, let's call it something better. Test name. Email foo@bar.com, and then password, it will be test. There you go. So that will be that. So then with that, we're still gonna make this call. We're gonna get back a response. Oh, but the only difference to this call is now we are going to supply a body. You can see here it's showing that it's requesting a body. So we can supply a body. And so with all of that done, the test should pass. Let's rerun this again. Fantastic. All right, awesome. So our spec is passing. So that was a positive test case. It's also the easiest thing to always do without worrying about 100% coverage. Everyone is always worried about 100% coverage. That's important, likely not achievable. So instead, what we should focus on are the obvious tests, right? There are pretty much always positive and negative tests. And there are boundary tests, right? Like, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with boundary value analysis. Let's say there's an expected range of 0 to 5 for some parameter. You want to test -1, 0, and 1, and 4, 5, and 6. So those will be your 6 test cases for that specific parameter. So if you cover those and any other weird scenarios you can think about, that's really good enough. And then at some point when you come across bugs, you fix the bug, you add a test. And of course, if you think of any other test, you can keep adding them along the way. So with all of that said, why don't we code up another test and make that one work as well. We're gonna do a negative test now, right? Make sure that it returns a 400 when we hit register with no body, because now our body is a requirement, right? And so that is exactly what we want to do. So here, I was just gonna get rid of this, and then we're gonna get rid of the body, and then we're gonna expect it to 400. Let's give this a run, adding our second test. Okay, this test failed, so you can see how the report looks, right? We had 2 tests, one's passing, one is failing. Let's take a look at why it says it's failing, and it's failing because it was a bad request. And this is actually absolutely expected because we're making the request right here. And so that request is failing and coming back with a 400. And so actually the rest of this code doesn't really have a capability to execute because the request itself fails. And so we need to fix that. So let's clean this up a bit. And to do that, we can add a bunch of different properties to our Cypress request. So we can do sci.request. And then we can configure an object in here. So we're going to do method is post URL is going to be this URL. Now this is the one that we want, is fail on status code. This one we want false because we don't want it to fail on status code. And then the body, there is not going to be a body because, and so now with all of that, all we have to do is just get rid of this, bring this one up to here. And so now everything should be good. Let's give this another run. And fantastic. 2 tests ran, 2 tests passing. One other thing I wanted to do here is to actually beef up this test a little bit, right? So for now, if we think in terms of the testing, what do we got? We got that when we hit the right endpoint with the right body, do we get the right response? When we hit the correct endpoint with no body, do we get an invalid response? And so with that, we're basically testing this endpoint and we're testing this line of code. What we're not testing is whether we're constructing this object correctly. And so we can actually just make this test a little bit beefier and say instead of returns 200 when we hit register, we can just say create user, right? And then we'll validate all the right things that we need to validate. So we definitely want to validate the status code, and then we can even validate the entire object as well. So we can do 1, 2, 3. So we can do response dot name to equal that's going to be test name, and I meant to make these single quotes. Okay, this is going to be email, so that's going to be foo@bar.com, and this one will be email. Oh, it's got to be a response.body.email. And that's why this one up here is complaining. Let's see if my IDE is helpful here. Saying unresolved variable name, perfect. .body.name. And then this one will be response.body.password. Perfect. And that's going to be test 0987. All right, that looks good. So we're validating 4 different things in a single test, which is really nice. Let's give this a run and see what happens. And of course, at some point, let's see if we have more time in this tutorial, we can always install a code coverage tool and start measuring code coverage of every single one of our classes that we create. But right now, we're just using our brains to create the test cases that we think that make sense. And perfect, we got 2 passing. And so what would happen if we messed one of these up and said names, for example, so we can see, it was quickly, but here that this test failed, register, create user, right, return, this one passed. And this one, we expect a test name, to equal test names, right? Because we changed that. So that actually broke because it was supposed to. So fantastic. That's a good, robust test. And while we're here, why don't we do a little bit of cleanup so that this code is better. We can actually wrap all of this into an organizational unit of the scribe. And so then you see that we can wrap all of this and we can say this is user/register endpoint. And then of course we'll pass an arrow function that'll then take in these tests. Oh. Let's cut them and paste them in there. Fantastic. And so now this will say user/register returns 400 with no body. And also creates user with valid body. And what else? We can remove the duplication. Well, of course, we can remove this URL here, right? So we can say const register endpoint. And that's going to be this guy right here. Excellent. And then we can just reuse that here. And we can also pass that in here. Any other duplication that we can remove? No, I think everything else looks good here. And just to show you all what happens when we add this describe block, so you can see it visually actually, we can pull up Cypress again. And now you'll see if I go into the spec, you'll see the nice organization that'll show up here. Oh, well, it failed probably because the server is not running. Let's start up the server. Let's double check first. Cypress. Yeah, it failed trying to load. So that is our server not running. Yeah, app crashed. Let's restart it. npm start. Hope I didn't. Oh, I broke something. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, cool. Figured out what happened. In me committing the code to Git, I accidentally deleted the .env file. And so it couldn't get the connection string for my database, but now it can. And so let's pull Cypress back up and get back to what I was trying to originally show you. We can open up this auth.spec, which I think is going to be here. And so now we can see the nice and clean organization. You can see that we have this user register part that comes from the describe block, and then each of the it blocks creates a test. And so now it just looks better, cleaner, more organized. And of course, we can take a look at each one of the tests. Oh, you know what else you really want to see is these users actually being added to the database. So let's come back here to our cluster, and we can actually click on this cluster, and we can come to collections, and it pulls up our databases. You can see here's the auth DB that we added in that string, and you can see here's a list actually of all of the users that we've created, and they're pretty much all the same because our tests keep hitting every single one of these users. But of course they have a unique ID, which allows them to be a unique data entry in here. So that's pretty cool, right? So you can see we have 32 total users. So the next thing that we want to do here is, if we're going to be doing authentication, then we need some validation for this kind of information, especially email and password, right? Because right now the problem is that we don't have any validation. So for example, let's say I make a password of 1 character, right? Very insecure password. And if we run this test, it will still allow me to create it. If it worked correctly, it would fail and say, hey, you're trying to create a password with a single character, it's not allowed. But you can see that both of our tests have passed. So that means we got a 200 status code and the user was created. So instead, we can actually add some validation to prevent this from happening. And so with that said, let's go back to auth.js. There we go. And so here we're going to install a package called @happyjoy. It's a very happy package. And then we are going to start using it here. So we can do const joy and then require happy joy. I think happy joy should be required out of every program, right? And I'm not talking about the package here. So with that said, we are going to use this to create a validation schema. So we can push this down a bit and let's create a const validation schema. And that's going to be a joy.object. And now we are going to provide a few fields here. Name. So we're going to do joy string. Oh. Min be 6. And it'll be required. Oh. Required. Excellent. And I'm going to do 2 more of these. And then this one, of course, will be email. And this one will also be a string required. And we will have some email validation. And then this one will be password. And for our password, minimum of 6 characters is required. Cool. So what, and let me spell this right here. So what we did here is basically create a validation schema that is going to be used to, whenever a post is created, we're going to validate against the schema to make sure that it meets these requirements. And Joy is going to do this for us. So it's going to make sure that the name property is a string with a minimum of 6 characters and that it's mandatory. The email, same thing. However, it has some extra email validation that goes with it. This, and then the password, same thing, is just a string with a minimum of 6 characters, and it is required. And let me get rid of this. We don't need that. Okay, cool. And so how are we going to validate? Well, we are going to come here. And first, we want to validate that the body is requirements that we set up here, right? And so for that, all we're gonna do is create a error object, and that's going to be validation schema dot validate, and that's going to be request dot body. So we're validating that our body matches what we define in the validation schema. If there's an error, then we're going to return a response status 400, and then we're going to send error details. We can do this for now and see what happens with that. And otherwise, it'll go through the same exact code as before. And so now we are actually having some validation. Let's double check this in our handy Postman. So for example, we've got this user, we've got this body, right? And so we said we want a minimum of 6 characters for the name. So if we do a 1 here and we send this, you can see that we get back this response here. First of all, it's a 400 bad request. Second, we get back this details object that says name length must be at least 6 characters long. And so it tells us that validation. And so that's coming from Joy. Of course, if we do the same thing for the password, and then we send that request, same thing, 400 request, says that password must be at least 6 characters long. And so now we have this validation, which we don't have to write any of the logic for, which is really fantastic because Joy makes our programming work happy. Okay, I should stop with these cheesy jokes. So with all of that said, everything is good here. However, this, I'm not going to say that it should be a minimum of 6 characters. I think it's silly. I feel like I've seen names of 2 characters. If you got a 1 character name, I am sorry, you will not be able to authenticate for our API. And all of that is great. And so now we've just added some validation. And what's next? Well, we can actually write some tests to make sure that our validation is being done as we've coded it. Let's go ahead and create a test for this. It should be really easy, but let's also take a look at exactly what do we want to validate, right? So there are many things that we can be testing here. However, one thing we don't really want to test is anything that Joy does, right? So whether it's validating that how it handles the number 2 or the number 6, we don't want to be doing boundary value testing around Joy, for example. What we do want to test is to make sure that if these are the requirements, that these fields, for example, have a minimum length of 2 and a minimum length of 6, that we test that. Also, for example, that they are required, right? So those are all different kinds of requirements for each one of these fields. And so let's go ahead and actually test this out. So to do that, we can just grab this test, for example. Now with these tests in place, it's really easy to write new tests. Throw that in here. And so now let's say it doesn't allow user creation with bad user body. Yeah, that seems appropriate. We can even, let's rename this one. Let's call this bad test user. And so for this one, we can just automatically validate a bunch of stuff, right? We can validate that the name is okay, that the email is invalid, and the password is also invalid. And so with all of that, we're going to expect the status code to equal 400. And then we'll probably expect also something from the body. Let's see what that body comes back with. But let's give this test a quick run just to make sure everything is working. Okay, cool. So let's see, something failed. Oh yeah, so of course it's failing with a 400, which is good. And then look, by the way, the body that comes back. The body that comes back with details. Oh, by the way, we needed to do one thing here, was to not get so much information back from this object. So instead, this is what details, and then get the first element message. Okay, so we can actually go back here and come back, validation schema.validate. Oh, here, yep, error dot details 0th object dot message. Okay, so that will make this message less messy, because you can see right now it's super messy. So look, if we rerun our test, we'll just get back the message. Which will be very useful on its own, but here, so 400 bad, and look, see that? We just get back this. Name length must be at least 2 characters long, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want in our error message. And so, of course, we want our test to not fail on status code. Great, that'll fix that problem. Oh, sorry, put it in the totally wrong place. Let's grab this guy here. It's getting late here where I am, and looks like my brain is running out of steam. So at some point I'm going to have to retire for the day, I think, because I am doing way too much crazy stuff. We got the request. There you go. All right. 1,000,000th time is the charm. Fingers crossed. And yes, 3 specs passing. Fantastic. So this is obviously validating that if we supply a bad test user, which we're not even supplying, we were request, man, you can see my brain is out of fuel Thank God for the IDE, you know, it was highlighting that in gray, and I was like, whoa, why it's highlighting it in gray? Okay, millionth and first time. That is the charm, I promise. Yes, there you go. All right. Actually, valid tests. Everything's great. So this is validating that we cannot create a user with a bad user body, right? And of course, we can even take it to the next level where we start validating the messages. So, for example, we can copy over another test. And this one can be a valid username. Email, this is invalid email. And then this is a valid password. There you go. So valid, invalid, valid. So with that, it should return a correct expect response status equal to 400. But I also want to see what kind of body that will return if we don't make this an email. Let's send that. Email must be a valid email. So we expect a 400 and we expect response dot body to equal email must be a valid email. Fantastic. Let's give this a run and see if it meets our needs. And of course, I need to change the name of this test. I'm going to have two tests with the same name. Fantastic. So we've got 4 tests that are passing. A bunch of them are negative tests, right? But that's okay because we have a bunch of negative validation that we need to do, and we just need to change the name. So here we can say it doesn't allow user creation with invalid password. Oh, sorry, email. And so let's say we were to make this a valid email, right? Just to make sure our logic is working. And run that. And I got a question for you to think about. Why don't we want to test the validation logic of this field? You know, like why don't we want to test, for example, that at email.com works, but at email just this doesn't work, or maybe something like that doesn't work, you know? Why don't we want to do that? Well, so we'll get back to that in a moment. Now that this finished running, let's take a look at actually, right? So you expected 200 to equal 400. Expected was the 400, got back at 200 because it was a valid email, right? So we're all good there. But back to my question for you to think about was the reason is because Joy is doing that validation. If we go back to authspec, not authspec, just auth.js, Joy is doing this validation. The email validation is coming from Joy. So they are a third-party system, and our reliance on them should mean that they have already tested that functionality, right? They tested to make sure that everything is working as expected, and it's not our job to test it. Now, if we find out that it doesn't work, then we log a bug with them and wait for the bug to get fixed, and then we have to figure out how we're going to do the workaround in our system. But we don't want to be testing that. I want to specify that because a lot of times I do see individuals testing third-party functionality. Like I've seen people testing, for example, file downloads and clicking a link and actually validating that they can type in some text into the modal of the operating system and then click the save button and then make sure that the file is actually saved on the system. That's testing third-party functionality. The operating system already checks that their download mechanism and save mechanisms work. So just want to make sure that I cover that. Cool. All right, so we've got a bunch of tests. We're not going to go cover every test here, right? We can have a lot of different tests. We can have tests for invalid email. We can have a test for invalid name and a invalid password, and make sure that all of those are being set. And we can even make sure that they are being required, right? We can supply just a test user with only 2 fields and make sure that we get back an appropriate error, right? Let's look at Postman, for example. Let's get rid of this one and send that, and then we should expect an appropriate response with that valid email, of course. See, that password is required, and so that's another stage of negative testing that we can do as well. Okay, so at this point, we're going to do some optimizations of this code. We're actually going to extract this logic into a separate class because in the future, we are going to have a login validation as well. And so we don't want to keep putting all of the rules in here. Instead, we're going to move it to a separate class. But before we do that, we need to run our tests to make sure that everything is passing, so that when we make changes, our tests can keep running and making sure that everything is working. That's actually one of the biggest advantages to automated testing, is that once you have the test in place, making changes to your code is a lot more comfortable. You're not scared about whether you're going to break anything. And so that's why I personally love having tests in place. So since it's been so frustrating to keep running our tests over and over, what we can do is actually enable Cypress to stay open whenever we create any file changes, and it'll keep running our automation. And so the way we do that is by running this command right here. So I'm gonna do that, hit enter, and that pulls up Cypress over here, right? And of course we can run our spec. Which I'm going to put over here so that you can see everything passed successfully, right? Everything is looking fantastic. And so now as we make any changes, the test will keep running and telling us whether we broke anything. So let's go ahead and actually make that change. So we're going to create a new file. Let's come here to the root, new file, and let's call this validation. Let's call it data validations. All right, then in here, all we're actually going to take is this stuff from here. Put that in there. And this validation schema will turn this into a function. So let's create a function, and we will call this function register validation. That'll take a request. And then this, we'll put this in there. And so now we're doing all the same things as before, and we just return the results. Validation schema dot validate, and that's going to take our request. Fantastic. So bring this up here. Oh, and let's put this inside of a class too. Let's call this class data validation. And let's put this function inside of the class. Excellent. And we can change it into static. There you go. Much better. And I realized that I didn't name this file correctly, so let's rename it and just call it data validation. Fantastic. And all of this is looking great. Of course, what we will need to do is do a module.exports. So we'll just do module.exports. And then in here, we will just pass in data validation. Fantastic. All right. And so with that, we can go back to our auth. And in here, we're going to use and then we're going to require. That's gonna be here, data validation. Perfect. And so with that, all we need to do here is do data validation. Oh, dot register validation. Oh, of course, wrap this in braces like this. There you go. And now this is finally recognized. I was like, what is going on here? So there you go. And so that is how we're going to reference all of our validations. They're going to live in a single place. And in fact, they can even be independently testable as well. And when we have a login validation, we're going to use this class as well and just put in a brand new method in there, and that shall be it. And in fact, if we look here, you'll see that our tests have been running. So for example, if I make a change, let me just make it smaller. If I make a change here, and come back here, we can do like this. Even better. So if I do a change like this, if I make any changes here, for example, like and save now, you can see it reruns the tests. And so it's pretty useful. Oh, and it broke. See that? I might have shut down. No, the server is running. There we go. Might have been an intermittent error with the internet, and so now everything is good. Okay, there's one other issue that we need to deal with here, and that's making sure that as we're creating users, that this will not happen if a user already exists. So we're going to add extra logic for validating that a user doesn't already exist. So check. So that's going to be the first part before we even create the users. And for that, we just do email exists. And then we're going to do an await. We can do user dot find. Actually, we'll do find one. And then we'll set email to request dot body dot email. And so we'll try to find the user, and then if email exists, email exists, there we go. Then we're going to return response.status. We'll return a 400 error code, and we're going to send a message that says user email already registered. Fantastic. And that'll be good. That's good right there. And so now we'll have validation logic that occurs before and user tries to get created 2 times. Let's run these tests and see what happens. Boom. So these tests broke. Let's see here. Bad request. Email already registered. And so now here in this test, we are facing a problem. Let's go take a look what's going on here in our test. That'll be auth.spec. I think this is this last test. Correct. And that is because you can see that it tried to create a user with this email, but of course this user already exists. And so we can have a test that validates that this works, but also this test needs to pass. And so we need to fix that. So how do we tackle this situation? This is a standard test data management situation that we have to deal with in our test automation. As you see, the strategy that we were using previously of hard-coded test data is the worst, because when we come across requirements like this, now it no longer works. We have 2 other strategies that we can use. If we had the time and I could show you how to create a good, robust API, the ideal strategy here would be to generate a brand new test user for every single test, use the test user, and then delete the test user afterwards. We would need a delete endpoint for that, which we don't currently have. So that is the most ideal situation for test data management, is to create test data, use it, and destroy it afterwards. However, because we don't have the time or the capabilities right now, we can use the other strategy, which is to dynamically generate some test data that we need, like an email, for example. And so for that, all we need to make sure is that every single time our email comes back as a unique value, and then we will always have a unique email. Now that's going to be problematic for our database, which is going to get filled up over time as we keep running tests. So at some point we will need to add a delete endpoint, but I'm not here to teach you the proper ways of test data management. I'm here to teach you how to create an authentication API and write some automated tests for it. So let's go ahead and make this happen. And so to do this, we're gonna do, let's see. And so now in here, we will install GUID. So GUID, it's a unique identifier that comes from an algorithm that basically ensures that anytime we use GUID, it will be unique. So for example, if we take a look at our package.json, we got GUID here. And so now let's go to our auth spec. In here, we're going to want to use GUID. Oops, not guild. Guild require, and that's going to be GUID. Excellent. And so with that, all we have to do is come down here. And so now we're going to do let email equals GUID.raw plus bar.com. Fantastic. And so again, GUID, just calling that method, will ensure that the first part of the email is always dynamic. And then we're just going to ensure that that value is correct as to what comes back from our logic, from our code that we implemented. And so now let's come back here. Our tests ran and they are successful. So that is how you get around that problem of creating dynamic, unique test data. But of course, keep in mind our database is going to keep getting full with these emails every time you run these tests. And while we're here, why don't we quickly add a test to validate that our logic is in place and working, because that is some good logic to ensure that it's always there and working. So we're going to do a post. We do want a static email. Excellent. So now we have a static email, and when we do a post, we are going to expect a 400 and the body to equal what was that message that we set up, email already registered. Let's put that in here, and of course let's rename the test. There we go. Let's rerun these tests. Let's see what happened here. So can't create duplicate users. Expected 200. Oh, somewhere. Oh, yeah, of course, that makes sense because this test was only executed the first time, right? So everything was successful. But now from this point forward, if we rerun this test, it will stay. So actually, let's rename this to something better. Do not delete user at email.com. Now you can see how very unstable this strategy is of hard-coded test data, because now anybody can delete this user from our database and then this test will fail. Again, the better approach would have been to create a user before this test executes, then go ahead and perform this request with the user already existing in the database. Everything would have failed as expected, and then we can delete that, cleaning up the database all the time. But so let's rerun it. We're going to get a 200. See, it failed again. And now if we run it again, it's going to pass. And so not the best testing strategy, but I do want to put this test in as it's important. And potentially in a future time, we can add more endpoints to make deletion of test users possible. So, and also let's rename this. Let's call it good test user. There you go. That's nice. Everything's great. Fantastic. All right, so the next optimization that we actually want to make is to encrypt our passwords. We've been saving our passwords directly in the database, which is a huge security no-no. So we should never ever do that except in demonstrations, of course. So in this case, we are going to start encrypting them so that this can actually be a real authentic API. So after we check to make sure that the user doesn't exist, at that point, we are going to decrypt the password as well. So let's go ahead and add some logic here. Sorry, not decrypt, encrypt the password. Have I been saying decrypt? Encrypt password, and decrypt is the opposite of encrypt. So to do that, it's going to be pretty easy. We're just going to use bcrypt.js. So we're going to do npm install bcrypt.js. And then once it installed, we're going to require it. bcrypt.js, there you go. And then to encrypt a password, it's really easy. So that's going to be, let's create a const encrypted password. And so then with that, we're just gonna do, we're gonna do bcrypt dot hash, and then it takes the password. So that's just gonna be request dot body dot password, and then it takes a salt, which is basically just how random you want the password to be. And then that will generate an encrypted password, and then with encrypted password we are going to save it into our user. Now this is pretty much done right here. However, what's going to happen to our tests? Some of them should fail, right? Where we were, let's see, create user with valid body. I am expecting that this one will fail because we were checking the password. So let's see now if everything works successfully. Boom, there we go. So create user with valid body. Let's see this error message. It failed. We got a 400. Response was bad request. Let's see. Error, promise, message, user validation failed. Cast to string value. Yeah, user validation failed. Password, cast to string failed for value promise at password. Okay, so I figured out what the problem was. The problem was that in our auth.js, I forgot the await command. And so as a result, it was failing. So I added the await command, reran the test, and now things are looking better. So we got 200 equal 200, test name equals test name. Our emails match up. By the way, you can see the GUID that shows up whenever we use it. And here you can see here's our encrypted password to equal that. And so that, of course, is where the failure is, which is so fantastic because our test is letting us know that, hey, our requirements have changed, and so our test fails. And so what we can do is now cement these requirements back in the test by going here, and we can make this test even better by saying to not equal test 0987, and so then we'll know that our password is being encrypted because it starts out here like this, and then we expect it to be different than this. So we can run this again, and fantastic. All of our tests are passing. By the way, one really good place to look at is now to MongoDB. By the way, you can see I have tons of records here. 81 users we've created so far. But then, so all the way here at the bottom, we can see our new test users being created first with the GUID in the emails, right? So you can see it's going to be junking up our database. But now we can also see the encrypted password thanks to bcrypt.js. So there, those are being stored. Okay, I'm getting super excited. We are so close to finishing our actual login authentication. Let's move on to the next step. And at this point, we're actually going to create a brand new route. So far, you've only seen our registration, and now we are going to actually add a login endpoint. So for that, we're simply going to come down here, and I'm just going to paste the code in here so that you don't have to watch me type. Of course, I'll explain it. And here, we just basically added a new post for the login endpoint. Okay. Next, we're also going to be doing a login validation with our request body. If there's an error, we're going to return the status code and the message as you've seen before. If there's not, we're going to check if the email exists. So same thing as you saw before, find one email. In fact, let me rename this so that it's more clear. If the user exists, we proceed. If not, we're going to throw another 400 and say email not found. And in fact, we can actually do something better. Instead of not found, we can say email not registered. There you go. Next, we're going to check that the password is correct. And so here we're using bcrypt compare method that will actually check the password that was passed in versus the password that was set in the user in the database. And we can rename this. That's better. User in the database. User in the database's password we're comparing, and then if it's the same, then we proceed. If not, we throw an invalid password error. And then finally, we return a 200 status code that says logged in if everything was successful. So one thing I realized here is that we want to change this status code actually to a 401 because 401 means unauthorized. So when the password that was set in the body doesn't match the password in the database, that's an invalid password, but of course it also means unauthorized. And so that's what 401 means. And also we are actually missing some login validation. So let me copy over this object, data validation, and we don't have any login validation. So let's go ahead and implement it. And if you remember, we were doing that in our data validation here. And so now all we need to do is add another login validation, and we'll have that object as well inside of our class. And you should already know how to do that. It's actually super simple. We'll grab this here, paste that in, just rename it to login validation. Then need to rename. We'll just do it like that. Of course, we're not going to need a name. And while we're here, I don't think we need a minimum amount of 6 should not be a minimum. Let's say 3 here, and password should definitely be 6 to keep our API secure. Probably even 8 would be better. We'll do it just like that. And then for registration, we'll do 8 as well. That might actually break some things, but let's see. All right, cool. Let's see what happens. Let's come back here to the terminal. Our server is running, so that's fantastic. Let's see what happens to the tests, and we'll decide what we... Oh, fantastic. Everything is working. Again, remember I talked about the safety of the tests. This is why I really like them. I don't have to worry about breaking anything. So we've got the valid... Oh, but of course we don't have any tests for login, so we'll handle that in a moment. So let's go back to our auth. So there's our login endpoint, and we have our login validation that's happening, and everything else should be good. So in fact, we can go ahead and write some tests and see what happens. All right, so let's come here, and we're going to just duplicate this file, and we're going to call it login.spec.js. That'll make it better. And then maybe actually we can rename this to register. That's better. So loginspec.js, that's going to be here, user/login. This will be user/login. And what's the easiest test to start with? Well, that's just ensuring that we can add a brand new user. That we can log in with a brand new user. So we can say can log in with valid user. Or even say just logs in. There we go. So this is not going to be a register endpoint. Let's rename this to login endpoint. There you go. We're going to post. We do want it to fail on status code. And let's see here. We're going to copy our do not delete user. That's good. Let's copy all of this. Once you have a single test, it's much easier to write more tests. But we do have to keep in mind of keeping them clean at some point as well. So we have our good test user, and in fact, let's rename this test user to static test user. So we're using this guy with this email all over the place, right? So then we're going to do a post to the login endpoint. We do want it to fail on status code because it's a positive test case, not a negative test case. And then we're going to expect the status code to be 200. And that's it. And now if we come here to Cypress, there you go. So now you can see we have two spec files that we're testing, user register and user login. Let's see what happened here. 400. Oh, name is not allowed, right? Our fantastic validation. So there you go. Get rid of that. Let's see what happens here. Unauthorized. I figured out the problem. I had all of these other old tests in here that should not be in here. That's the problem of copying and pasting files, is sometimes you just forget even the basic things. So anyways, with that, we finally have a positive test case that does what we expect it to do. And now let's give this a run and see what happens. Here, let's put in a user that I know exists because we've used them before. Let me drag this over for you so you can see our postman. Here's our postman. So look here, if we supply our email and password and then send, we can see that we get back a logged in. So this is the user that we're going to use. There you go. Let's give this a shot. Yes, and finally we've got a positive working test that validates that our login endpoint works as expected. All right, let's proceed here. Had to do a quick outfit change. It's actually getting pretty chilly over here in Florida. I think it's like 65 degrees today. So I had to throw on a hoodie. Anyways, next step is for us to add a JSON Web Token to our login. So why we want to add a JSON Web Token to our login is because whenever you log in, you want to be authenticated through the rest of your session, right? You don't want to have to keep logging in for every single request. And so that's how a login actually works, is once you're logged in, you can either get a JSON Web Token or you can get a cookie that gets dropped on your browser. And because of that, the browser and the application knows that you have been properly authenticated to access this application. And so we're going to implement that point right now. So to do that, it's actually very simple. Let's go to our auth.js. And then down here, after we have a valid password, this is where we're going to install our JSON Web Token. So let's do JSON Web Token. Fantastic. And so with that said, after we have our login, we are going to create a token. And then, of course, have to import. Can't forget the import. Can do JWT. There you go. Now let's come back down here. And now with JWT, we can do assign. And then we're going to pass in an object there. We're going to set an ID of our user in DB dot ID. That's the property on our, one of the properties on our users. And then the second parameter that this takes is a secret or private key. You can see there. So we're just going to do process.env.token secret. So here we are actually going to be passing in some token secrets. So with that, we need to do our .env file. And there it is. And so now we can come here and do token secret. And then you can set this to any value. How about let's do secret value 123. Perfect. And so with that, that will create our token. Okay. And now we can actually respond back in a header with this token. So we're going to do our response.header. And then in here, we are going to set auth token key. And here's the value, which will be the token. Fantastic. And then we're going to send back status code 200. And we're going to send back the token as well, the token value string. There you go. And we no longer need this. And that looks good. So now if we come back here to Postman and we do a login and do a send, you can see that it comes back with this token. And you can even see here also, if you look at the headers, it comes back with this auth token here that is going to let our application know that this user is authenticated and can access specific endpoints that they need. So let me quickly show you one thing here. So if you go to jwt.io And then we come here and we grab our token. Where's the here, sorry. We grab this token, and then we come back here and we paste it down here. You can see that it provides some information about this token. So it provides an ID, and also it provides an issued at date. You can see this was when this token was issued. And then if you want to set an expiration on this token of, let's say, 1 hour, so that your user has to log back in after an hour, you can do that here as well. And so this is just for decoding. Now keep in mind, nobody can mess with anything here, like messing with the ID or anything like that, because you have your secret environment variable that's stored only on your server, that only your server knows about. So as long as you don't check it into source control, that's why it's super important to keep your environment variables in your environment. You should be good to go. Okay, so how do we actually use this JSON Web Token that we have created? Well, let me show you that. So in order to save you from a bunch of typing, I've already implemented some of the logic here, and I'm going to explain to you what I've done. So as you can see, I've created a brand new route that I've called posts.js. I created this variable called router, and I've also created this variable called verify that's being imported from this verify token file. We'll get to that in a moment. Then I've created a new get method that we can implement, right? The get method just hits directly here. And then we're passing in this verify. And then of course we have our request and response. And then all this does is return a JSON body that shows an object of posts, and it says my first post and description. So let me show you what exactly that looks like. And actually, I'm going to remove this verify for now to show you what happens here. And so you can see here I have my get posts. And so this, oh, and of course you need to also know how can I make it so that I can hit it. That goes in the index.json. You can see I grouped my routes together. So here's a post route where I'm requiring the posts that I just created. And so then here I'm hooking it up to the endpoint of the route middleware. You can see it's going to be API/posts, and then I'm hooking it up to that file that I created. So that's how now we can come here and do API/posts and do a get instead of a post as it used to be before. And if we do a send, you see we get back this body, this object of posts that says a title and a description. Now, where does the JSON Web Token actually come in? Well, we can make this only accessible when you are able to log in. And so how do we do that? Well, let's go back here. That is where this verify comes in. And actually, let me even rename it, but we'll leave it the verify. Verify. There you go. And this verify will force the endpoint to actually use the JSON Web Token that we have created. So let me show you that now. Let me hit this endpoint again, and you can see that it says access denied, 401 unauthorized. So how did we make that part happen? Well, that's here in the verify token function. A verify token file. You can see we're exporting this module, which is a function that sends in these three parameters: request, response, and next. Okay, here we are using from the request, we're checking the header for an auth token, and if it has the auth token, we'll proceed. If it doesn't, it throws an access denied, which is exactly what you just saw. However, if it does, we're going to try to verify with JSON Web Token that the token that's coming back from the header matches to what we expect. And so if it does, we can assign the verified token to our user, and then we proceed to the next step of the code. And so with all of that, let's take a look at exactly how to make this happen. So as you can see, this is denied. However, if we come back here, and I accidentally renamed everything, let's send this, get back our JSON web token, right? Let's come here to get posts, and in our headers, we're going to add a new key that's called auth token, and then we're going to supply the value, and then we're going to send. And you can see that now we have access to this information. And so that is exactly the logic that you saw here in IntelliJ, where we're basically getting back that header. We said, yes, we have the auth token. The auth token was validated, and so then we were able to move on. But what if we try an invalid auth token and say, let's get rid of this and do 1, 2, 3 and try to access again. Invalid token, we get that error as well. And so that is really pretty much it. And we have successfully created a login API where you can register a user. You can log in as that user and get back a JSON web token that you can then use for your sessions to be able to access information that is behind the authentication, like our post functionality. Now, let's check all of our tests, make sure that everything is working. You can see everything is working. All of our functionality that we previously implemented, it continues to work. Of course, you can write some more tests, and I'm going to actually leave that for you to do as an exercise. Some really good things to do is to try to access our application without having a token and seeing that you get back a 401 access denied. You can also try to access the application with an invalid token and make sure that you get back a 400. And of course, you can also try to access the posts endpoint with a valid token and make sure that you can log in. Those are 3 really good tests to do that will support the functionality that has been implemented all throughout that I just showed you. Well, thanks again. Enjoy that exercise. Let me know what you come up with, and see you next time.